Hi everyone, Kashlaka Chokma, Sahupchifoat Shannon Speed, Chikasha Michichat Saya, UCLA American Indian Studies Center Director Saya, Gabrielino Tongva, Oblakot Yagni Mako Apisa Hanchi, B Kanatoka, Hachimanolili. Greetings everyone and welcome. I'm Shannon Speed and I'm Chickasaw and Choctaw by descent and a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and I'm the director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. In my Chickasaw greeting, I recognize the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovanga, the unceded land that encompasses much of what is currently called Los Angeles, as well as the South Channel Islands, and upon which the American Indian Studies Center and UCLA reside. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukretam ancestors, Ahihiram elders, and Eohinkim, our relations and relatives past, present, and emerging. I'll now turn it over to our program director, Pamela Peters, who will introduce our guest today.
Welcome everybody. My name is Pamela J. Peters. I am the Operations and Event Coordinator of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. As a Dene woman living here on Tovanga, otherwise known as Los Angeles, I too would like to pay my respects to the Tongva ancestors, the elders, and all relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. I feel it's important that we acknowledge our tribal relatives' homeland, and I understand I am a visitor here as my homeland is the Navajo Nation. Welcome again to our afternoon book talk with Tommy Orange. We are very excited about this particular event. We are particularly excited to host this outstanding and provocative author. For the first portion of our afternoon, Dr. Shannon Speed, the director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center, and Tommy Orange will engage in a discussion about his work. Thereafter, we will open up the discussion to the audience for questions. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, or if you like, either use the raise a hand icon or contact me in the chat box, and I will unmute you so you can ask questions directly. Please also include your name and your question as you speak. Tommy Orange is a graduate of the MFA program of the Institute of American Indian Arts from Santa Fe, New Mexico. An enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Tribes of Oklahoma, he was born and raised in Oakland, California. Tommy Orange's debut book, There, gives a glimpse into the lives of 12 Native American characters whose lives collide at an annual powwow. The novel provides an exhilarating, contemporary, and poetic voice depicting the experiences of American Indians living within an urban environment. Orange's book has received the prestigious 2019 PEN/Hemingway Award for a distinguished first novel. It was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize and recipient of countless awards and critical acclaim. Please welcome Tommy Orange.
Hi everyone, thank you for that introduction, Pamela. I am going to be reading from the prologue, not the whole thing, but don't want to bore everyone. Just going to read parts of it, selected parts of it. Thank you for all, anyone who is there, wherever you are. Prologue. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Bertolt Brecht. Indian head. There was an Indian head, the head of an Indian, the drawing of the head of a head-dressed, long-haired Indian depicted, drawn by an unknown artist in 1939, broadcast until the late 1970s to American TVs everywhere after all the shows ran out. It's called the Indian head test pattern. If you left the TV on, you'd hear a tone at 440 hertz, the tone used to tune instruments. And you'd see that Indian, surrounded by circles that looked like sights through rifle scopes. There was what looked like a bullseye in the middle of the screen, with numbers like coordinates. The Indian's head was just above the bullseye, like all you'd need to do is nod up in agreement to set the sights on the target. This was just a test. In 1621, colonists invited Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoags, to a feast after a recent land deal. Massasoit came with 90 of his men. That meal is why we still eat a meal together in November, celebrated as a nation. But that one wasn't a Thanksgiving meal. It was a land deal meal. 2 years later, there was another similar meal meant to symbolize eternal friendship. 200 Indians dropped dead that night from an unknown poison. By the time Massasoit's son Metacomet became chief, there were no Indian pilgrim meals being eaten together. Metacomet, also known as King Philip, was forced to sign a peace treaty to give up all Indian guns. 3 of his men were hanged. His brother Wamsuta was, let's say, very likely poisoned after being summoned and seized by the Plymouth court, all of which led to the first official Indian War, the first war with Indians, King Philip's War. 3 years later, the war was over and Metacomet was on the run. He was caught by Benjamin Church, the captain of the very first American Rangers, and an Indian by the name of John Alderman. Metacomet was beheaded and dismembered, quartered. They tied his 4 body sections to nearby trees for the birds to pluck. Alderman was given Metacomet's hand, which he kept in a jar of rum and for years took around with him, charged people to see it. Metacomet's head was sold to Plymouth Colony for 30 shillings, the going rate for an Indian head at the time. The head was put on a spike, carried through the streets of Plymouth, then displayed at Plymouth Fort for the next 25 years. In 1637, anywhere from 400 to 700 Pequot gathered for their annual Green Corn Dance. Colonists surrounded their village, set it on fire, and shot any Pequot who tried to escape. The next day, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a feast and celebration, and the governor declared it a day of Thanksgiving. Thanksgivings like these happened everywhere, whenever there were what we have to call successful massacres. At one such celebration in Manhattan, people were said to have celebrated by kicking the heads of Pequot people through the streets like soccer balls. The Indian head in the jar, the Indian head on a spike, were like flags flown, to be seen, cast broadly, just like the Indian head test pattern was broadcast to sleeping Americans as we set sail from our living rooms over the ocean blue-green glowing airwaves to the shores, the screens of the New World. One thing we should keep in mind moving forward is that no one ever rolled heads down Temple stairs. Mel Gibson made that up. But we do have in our minds, those of us who saw the movie, the heads rolling down Temple stairs in a world meant to resemble the real Indian world in the 1500s in Mexico. Mexicans before they were Mexicans, before Spain came. We've been defined by everyone else and continue to be slandered despite easy to look up on the internet facts about the realities of our histories and current state as a people. We have the sad, defeated Indian silhouette and the heads rolling down Temple stairs. We have it in our heads. Kevin Costner saving us, John Wayne's 6-shooter slaying us, an Italian guy named Iron Eyes Cody playing our parts in movies. We have the litter-mourning, tear-ridden Indian in the commercial, also Iron Eyes Cody, and the sink-tossing crazy Indian who was the narrator in the novel, the voice of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We have all the logos and mascots, the copy of the image of an Indian in a textbook. All the way from the top of Canada, the top of Alaska, down to the bottom of South America. Indians were removed, then reduced to a feathered image. Our heads are on flags, jerseys, and coins. Our heads were on the penny first, of course, the Indian cent, and then on the buffalo nickel, both before we could even vote as a people, which, like the truth of what happened in history all over the world, and like all that blood spilled from slaughter, are now out of circulation. Hard, fast. Getting us to cities was supposed to be the final necessary step in our assimilation, absorption, erasure, the completion of a 500-year-old genocidal campaign. But the city made us new, and we made it ours. We didn't get lost amid the sprawl of tall buildings, the stream of anonymous masses, the ceaseless din of traffic. We found one another, started up Indian centers, brought out our families and powwows, our dances, our songs, our beadwork. We bought and rented homes, slept on the streets, under freeways, We went to school, joined the armed forces, populated Indian bars in the Fruitvale in Oakland, and in the Mission in San Francisco. We lived in boxcar villages in Richmond. We made art and we made babies and we made way for our people to go back and forth between reservation and city. We did not move to cities to die. The sidewalks and streets, the concrete absorbed our heaviness. The glass, metal, rubber and wires, the speed, the hurtling masses. The city took us in. We were not urban Indians then. This was part of the Indian Relocation Act, which was part of the Indian Termination Policy, which was and is exactly what it sounds like. Make them look and act like us, become us, and so disappear. But it wasn't just like that. Plenty of us came by choice, to start over, to make money, for experience. Some of us came to cities to escape the reservation. We stayed after fighting in the Second World War, after Vietnam too. We stayed because the city sounds like a war, and you can't leave a war once you've been. You can only keep it at bay, which is easier when you can see and hear it near you, that fast metal, that constant firing around you. Cars up and down the streets and freeways like bullets. The quiet of the reservation, the side of the highway towns, rural communities. That kind of silence just makes the sound of your brain on fire that much more pronounced. Plenty of us are urban now. If not because we live in cities, then because we live on the internet, inside the high rise of multiple browser windows. They used to call us sidewalk Indians, called us citified, superficial, and authentic, cultureless refugees, apples. An apple is red on the outside and white on the inside. But what we are is what our ancestors did, how they survived. We are the memories we don't remember, which live in us, which we feel, which make us sing and dance and pray the way we do. Feelings from memories that flare and bloom unexpectedly in our lives, like blood through a blanket from a wound made by a bullet fired by a man shooting us in the back for our hair, for our heads, for a bounty, or just to get rid of us. I think I'll stop there.
Great. Chukmashki, Tommy, thanks so much for being with us and for sharing that reading from the prologue to your novel, There. So the book has a prologue as well as an interlude that, inform the reader but aren't directly part of the story itself. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, the prologue, as we just heard, is written with humor and irony, and kind of recites a history of atrocities and slurs against Native people. What was the role of the prologue, and what effect did you intend for it to have on readers? Does it kind of set readers up to understand what's going to unfold in the novel?
I think I first, I like prologues, first of all, the way that they function in novels, and how you can kind of do whatever you want with them, and also how the reader can skip them if they don't like. A lot of people don't like prologues, and you can just skip it and get to the story, and that's fine. I like that skippability about it, and it feels like it frees you up to do more of whatever you want because of the skippable nature of it. In literature and in depiction in media in general, we haven't really been allowed very much nuance or range in what we look like, where we're from. And so the idea of an urban Indian, even though I was very familiar with it, having grown up in Oakland and worked in the urban Native community in Oakland for many years, I knew that it wasn't a generally known thing, even among other Native people. Not always is it a really like a recognizable thing. So I wanted to write it. It's all written in the form of we, even though it's been called essay. They've been called essays, the prologue and the interlude. I wrote them sort of like a Greek chorus, like this is who we are as urban Native people, to set up the context for the characters' lives before the story starts. So that's the thinking that I had going into the prologue. Initially, the prologue was the prologue and the interlude all at the beginning, and now and then my editor told me that it was too long, and so to make sure it stayed in the book, I just cut it in half and put the other half in the middle and called it an interlude. So that's how that happened.
Interesting. Well, I might ask you to read a little bit from the interlude down the road here and ask you a question about that. But while we're talking about the prologue, there were a lot of things about it that were interesting to me, but one of them was that under the section, I think it was titled, so the subtitle of the section was urbanity. And you make an assertion about cities, you know, that everything in them is also of the earth and interconnected. And I found it so refreshing as a Native person born and raised in Los Angeles and urban Indian myself, because I feel like all too often there's this dichotomy set up between urban and rural Indians. And in that, there's always an implicit or explicit, sometimes assumption that the urban is less Indian, right? So could you say something about that? Was this one goal of the book, to make that point?
Sure. I think, yeah, I wanted to explore urban Native identity in general. You know, to what you were just saying, we would go back to where my dad grew up in Oklahoma. It was a very rural area in Oklahoma, in western Oklahoma, a small town called Hammond, Oklahoma. And our cousins very much looked down on us, our family, because, well, we're half Cheyenne. My mom is white, so that's for one reason. And then also we're from the city and did not live the same life as them. And to them, it wasn't reservation life, but it was similar to it. It's a tribal jurisdiction land, and there's a lot of similarities to reservations. So that was, to them, was the authentic Native life. And, you know, you live closer to the tribe, and you see a lot more Cheyenne Arapaho people when you're in that part of Oklahoma. And you, so I knew that sort of deficit in Native identity, and people from the city, and just carrying that with them. But also, to what you said, wanting to deconstruct the idea of land and home and belonging, and the idea that, like, cities and buildings and freeways, to demystify the idea that nature is out there in the woods or in the mountains or in the desert, and it's not where cities are, as if we're not of the earth. I really wanted to make it clear that part of the trouble we're in around climate change has to do with Christian ideology and believing that God gave us the earth to hold dominion over, and we sort of have it temporarily until we get to heaven, and we can do whatever we want with it, which leads to exploitation. And you see exploitation of the land. Whereas if you were to see a relationship to the land and even cities, it's more of a Native worldview. I can't speak for all tribes, obviously, but the idea of all our relations and the relationship to things and environment is just different. And I wanted to explore what that could look like for somebody who was born and raised in the city, to look around and see, you know, familiar parts of their environment could be buildings, could be streets, could be a bus ride. And it's not entirely dissimilar from, you know, when we talk about ancestral homelands, it's about people building memories on the land and building relationships to that part of the land. And they love it because they know it, and their parents knew it, and their grandparents knew it, and they taught them how to relate to that area. And the same kind of things happen in cities. And so I just really wanted to establish that as a way to build range and nuance around what Native identity could look like.
Yeah, I think that's such an amazing and important point. I really appreciate it. You know, the novel is the first kind of widely read novel on urban Indian experience. Yet at the same time, it's about a very particular time and place, right? So it isn't a stand-in for all urban Indian experience. People have said that the city of Oakland is more a character than a setting in the novel. So could you talk about that and the particularities of things like relocation, Alcatraz, and the history, that particular history and its links to the of identity at work in the novel?
Yeah, so being born and raised in Oakland, and then working, you know, in a very specific community and learning a lot about the history of Native people in the area, like you said, Alcatraz, and just having a love for Oakland because it's my home, and not seeing it written about very much in literature. Not seeing it depicted very much. Growing up in an era where, like, we were most famous for being either the murder capital of the country, or like we're in the top 10. That's sort of what we're known for, or, you know, different hip hop movements. just knowing that how much there was to represent about Oakland that belonged in the pages. I feel that belonged in the pages of literature. Not that I assumed that what I wrote was going to end up there, but you know, when you go to try to write a book, there's some level of assumption that you're trying to write into the space of the medium that you're writing into. So I just, I feel really strongly about Oakland and love the city, and wanted to specifically represent Oakland and what Native life in Oakland was like. And I think getting into specificity tends to tap into universality. And I wasn't trying to represent all urban Native people, just like I wasn't trying to represent all Native people. I was trying to get as close to my own story and the story that I knew from my home that I could.
Oh, I think you did a beautiful job of representing Oakland in the novel. I was wondering if, when you were writing it, maybe this is a silly question, but as Pamela noted up front, there are 12 characters in the novel, and you weave them through and bring them all together at the end of the novel. What was, I mean, why did you choose to have 12 characters? And did they ever get like tangled up in your mind when you were writing the novel? It seems like that would be a lot to manage as a writer. And I also wondered if you could talk about why the novel opens and closes with Tony Loman.
So what helped around the idea of getting confused and having the narratives get tangled and messy, which they did, is that the premise for the book, the way it came to me, the idea was always that they were all going to end up at this powwow. So it was a through line for everyone. I had to figure out what their relationship to the powwow was and how they were going to get there. So that helped in keeping everything organized. But, you know, it took 6 years to write, and there was a lot of different versions of it and a lot of characters that didn't end up making it to the final book. There were, like, you know, grandparent stories that at some point I thought would be in there that didn't end up panning out. So Tony and several of the core characters came to me the first year of writing it, and Tony came really fast. And maybe about halfway through writing the book, I'd already known he was going to begin the book because his chapter sort of frames the powwow, and that serves as a sort of narrative engine for the reader as you go through all these different lives. You're also, as the reader, sort of having to keep in mind, okay, they're all headed to the powwows. So at some point, about halfway through writing it, I wrote this. I wrote the end to the book, and I sort of just knew it was the end when I wrote it. And it was Tony, and he plays this sort of anti-hero role, which I always love an anti-hero. So about halfway through, I knew it was Tony who would end the book, and that he started it out, helped to have kind of a clean structure. But it was just something about a moment when I wrote this, the way it actually ends. I wrote it and I was like, this is the ending of the book. And I had to figure out how to make that work. But when I wrote it, I knew that it was the end. So it was partially decided and partially just sort of happened.
Well, since you've raised the ending of the book, maybe we could talk about that. How do you address, you know, some folks that feel that the book doesn't have an ending?
I think it was always going to end tragically in my mind when I conceived of it. And the sort of the not finding out aspect of it. I like the way that forces the reader to engage with their own faith and what they believe, and what might I have been hinting toward. Will your own faith pull you in the direction of like hope or despair? I like the way that engages the readers, you know, their perspective, their worldview, their faith, the way they think of the way things should end. When I was finishing writing the book, Standing Rock was happening. It was a very bleak time. Trump was just getting in to office. And so it certainly didn't seem like the right time to put a nice bow at the end of the novel. And after, when I finished it, I hadn't intended on writing another book, a sequel, but about 3 months before the book came out, it started happening. And I sold the book right before COVID hit, and planning on turning in the next draft in December, and it's supposed to come out in 2022. So if you didn't feel you're happy with the ending, there is maybe the next book will be just one big ending for you.
Oh, okay, great. Sounds terrific. Maybe I'll ask you if you would read a little bit of the interlude, and I wanted to ask kind of a similar question about it that I asked for the prologue. You know, what role did you see it serving? I mean, originally you had this information in the prologue, but it gets set in the middle and kind of sets up, you know, I feel like it plays a dual role. I mean, it kind of educates the reader about what in particular about what the Oakland pow-wow is, right, where the story will culminate. And I also wondered about both the prologue and interlude, if you thought, if you were writing in a way for multiple audiences, like in a way that would be humorous to the native audience and educational to others.
I don't think that I don't generally write with any particular audience in mind. I do write with the reader in mind, and I want to write something that that feels very readable and engaging. I definitely, at the time, I wrote half of the book before getting into my MFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I wrote half of it while in the program. And in the program, they encourage you to read in front of everyone, and you have like 3 minutes to read. And so if there was any audience ever, it was my fellow classmates in my MFA. And they were also readers in my workshops of my work. So sometimes I had imagined them reading it. I never imagined, you know, some big audience, so I wasn't trying to educate anyone. I also knew when I was writing some of the stuff in the prologue and the interlude that a lot of Native people know a lot of this history. And so I wanted to write it in as strong a way as I could, that even if you knew the information, I was at least saying it in a way that felt reframed, in a way that felt fresh, in a way that is paying attention to language. And so if there was an audience, it was a Native one. I thought maybe the director of my school said if I published a book, I could get a teaching job. And that was my goal coming out of the program, was to get a job teaching, because I didn't have a job at that point. I was just in the MFA program. I had a lot of side hustles, but so I'd never intended it with a big audience to educate, but I wanted to frame everything in a way that the way in the middle, we sort of leave off Orville thinking about the powwow and learning to dance. And then we find out about the Oakland powwow and powwows in general. And then I don't know, there's just a lot of that I've been thinking about for years that I wanted to get out around blood and, you know, the imminent mass shooter thing has been on everyone's mind for a long time. And that sort of played into it. And that, you know, that's sort of looming over the book, these shooters planning this thing. So, okay, so I'll read, I will read just a little bit from the interlude.
Great, thank you.
Big Oakland powwow. In the Oakland Coliseum parking lot for the Big Oakland powwow, there is one thing that makes many of our cars the same. Our bumpers and rear windows are covered with Indian stickers, like we're still here, and my other vehicle is a war pony, and sure, you can trust the government, just ask an Indian. Custer had it coming. We did not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrowed it from our children, fighting terrorism since 1492, and my child didn't make the honor list, but she sure can sing an honor song. There are Schimmel Sister stickers and Navajo Nation stickers, Cherokee Nation stickers, Idle No More, and AIM flags duct taped to antennas. There are dream catchers and tiny moccasins, feathers and beaded miscellany hanging from rearview mirrors. We are Indians and Native Americans, American Indians and Native American Indians. North American Indians, natives, NDNs and Indians, status Indians and non-status Indians, First Nation Indians and Indians so Indian we either think about the fact of it every single day or we never think about it at all. We are urban Indians, indigenous Indians, res Indians, and Indians from Mexico and Central and South America. We are Alaska Native Indians, Native Hawaiians, and European expatriate Indians, Indians from 8 different tribes with quarter blood quantum requirements and so not federally recognized Indians, kinds of Indians. We're enrolled members of tribes and disenrolled members, ineligible members and tribal council members. We're full-blood, half-breed, quadroon, 8th, 16th, 32nds, undoable math, insignificant remainders. Is that a good amount? Is that okay?
Yeah, sorry, I lost my unmute button for a second. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reading that. And, you know, as you said in that interlude, you also, you know, kind of talk about blood and this question of mass shootings. That's part of all of our shared experience in this country, unfortunately, is kind of very present in the novel. Do you want to talk a little, and it ends, you know, the shooting that happens ends up being a very Indian experience, right? And the pow-wow. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, blood is such a tricky and I'll keep it a tricky area for Native people, and a lot of people don't understand how awful the history is and how designed it is for our erasure. And so, you know, it weighs on me on a personal level because my tribe is quarter blood requirement, and my son, who he would be able to enroll because I'm half and he'd be quarter, but my dad's an engineer, and he called me one day to kind of explain to me, because I'm wanting to get him enrolled and wanting my dad to fix it because he was working for the tribe at the time. And he said, well, the way I got it figured out, son, is you're 364 short of a half. So we have some Lakota blood on my dad's side, and I think I'm like 128th German or maybe 64th German on that side, and that's the amount short that I am, and then whatever double 364ths is the amount that my son is short. And so, you know, we're defined from the outside. We haven't been allowed to self-identify. We're supposed to be like respected nations, but we're called members, like we're part of a gym. Like if we were part of, people that are citizens of nations don't have blood requirements. We should be considered, you know, members of nations. Like if you were a dual citizen and you had citizenship in Spain, then you're a Spanish citizen. And yet, you know, we're constantly, you know, still to this day, we have the president of the United States is making fun of Elizabeth Warren and calling her Pocahontas publicly, and it's a joke. It's a joke to him, and the way this government has treated its original people is a joke. And it's a sad reality for us, and we're, you know, sort of constantly, our issues are not really being ever brought up or addressed in any significant way. So just wanted to address the blood thing there, and the mass shooting thing, it feels less prevalent now because of this year, and this year's felt like 10 years. But before the virus, it was certainly something that was constantly in the news cycle. And so it had been on my mind for many years. I mean, we're going all the way back to Columbine. We've lived with the idea that a shooter could show up anywhere. So that's how that ended up in there.
Yeah, the whole question of blood, and you know, goes back directly to government policies of blood quantum designed to eliminate us, right? And they're still doing it today, right? With this one tiny percentage that will not allow your son now to be registered. And to your point about, you know, being able to be like other nations, we shouldn't have to be a certain percent to qualify. When people ask me what percent Chickasaw I am, I say I'm a 100% tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for that. I'm going to ask, moving on to a different, a different vein. Could you tell me about the title of the novel? Because, you know, I know the book talks about the Gertrude Stein quote about Oakland having no there there, but also the Radiohead song "There There" appears in the novel. And what maybe you could just talk about the title a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So as late as 2014, I had a very messy half of the book written. And I had this quote from Gertrude Stein, which I'd found just doing research about what other Oakland authors had written about Oakland. And there's not that much. There's Gertrude Stein, who writes about not writing about Oakland. And we have Jack London, who writes about the wild mostly. There's not that very much writing about Oakland, and he's not originally from Oakland. And Ishmael Reed wrote a book called A Blues Walk in Oakland, which is excellent, but he's not from Oakland either. So just kind of figuring out what other authors have written about Oakland, I stumbled upon this quote, and immediately it resonated for many reasons, partly because people have used it to diss Oakland, like Oakland doesn't have any kind of like, there's no spirit of Oakland, or there's no substance to what Oakland is as a city, and everyone who knows Oakland or is from Oakland knows the opposite is true. But then also the way it resonated with me about Native people, and you know, the way we relate to land and theirness. Like if you're growing up in the city, and to be authentic, you're supposed to be at your reservation or mystically in the wild somewhere. Your theirness and your ability to call someplace like Oakland your home is in question. And so there were so many resonances. And in 2014 is when I landed on just calling it "There There," from just pulling from the quote. So that's where that came from.
Yeah, okay, great. So one of the characters in the novel asks the question, you know, if Indigenous art isn't pulling from tradition, how is it Indigenous? And I wondered if that was something you had to wrestle with in the creation of the novel, and if so, what, you know, did you learn in the process of that?
I don't know that I think before I started writing There There and knew what kind of book I wanted to write, I think there were short stories and things that I was working on that more referred to where my dad grew up, to be writing sort of a Native narrative, for it to be considered that. I think I was a little bit falling into that. But once I had enough years in the community and did a bunch of storytelling work in Oakland, and once I started writing There, I didn't struggle while I was writing the book with that idea. I felt pretty solid about what I wanted to do, but I think Native artists in general have to struggle with that, have to struggle with being recognized as it being Native. And if you want to be relevant, you want to be modern and have it feel contemporary. That's something that art strives to do. You can't forever be doing traditional art and feel like you're relevant to and reaching young people and new people. Like artists want to reach people of now and be referencing things happening, to what it feels like to be living now. That's something that art is supposed to have a relationship to and interact with and engage with. So it's just a challenge. It's still a challenge for people to be doing Native art and not have to reference heavily on something that's like feathers or, you know, beadwork or horses. You know, there's just kind of like all these cliches that we're stuck with, and we're sort of damned if we do and damned if we don't. There's a built-in paradox to being a Native artist. And so I just wanted to address it because the character who was thinking about it was an aspiring writer, and it's something that I think writing is actually one of the mediums that's easiest to overcome that. I think visual art is a lot harder to overcome that that burden of representation.
Mm-hmm.
Because writing, you can just sort of write through it, and you can sort of bring up the fact of it, or you In my opinion, it's easier to overcome that particular burden.
So that's a good segue to a question about writing and Native lit. Do you want to say anything about your thoughts on the current state of Native literature? Who are you reading right now? Who are you excited about? Who are your influences?
I think it's an amazing time for Native literature, not only because the publishing industry is really getting better at diversity and really feels like it's trying wholeheartedly, even though it doesn't always seem like that when you look at the numbers. I think there's significant change in how many Native books are coming out and how much attention a lot of other people who can make books happen in a serious way, that's happening. And I think that's really cool. And part of what I want to be able to do with the privilege that I have as an author who's gotten the exposure that I've gotten is to be able to help other authors get exposure too. So, Louise Erdrich is my favorite writer in the Native canon by far. And there's a lot of influence I've gotten from books in translation. I read a lot of books in translation before I started reading American literature and even Native American literature. I was reading a lot of works in translation. I was late to reading, so I didn't read it all in elementary school or middle school or high school. I was an athlete. I played roller hockey, and then I became a musician. And it wasn't until after college that I was working at a used bookstore, and I fell in love with fiction for the first time. And I first came to love Kafka and Borges, and weird writers like Robert Walser made me want to write. And later got into Clarice Lispector, and she's sort of stream of consciousness-y. And I think I was doing a lot of stream of consciousness writing at first, which can be super annoying, especially if you're first starting out writing. So I'm much more influenced by a lot of different books than following particular authors and following their styles. I like reading contemporary novels. I like reading what's coming out right now and what new voices are coming out and what people are doing with structure and voice. So if that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I know we're all excited to hear about the new book. There are also rumors flying about that this one may be adapted into a film or a series. Is that, can you confirm or deny those reports?
They're there. The TV rights have been bought. Right now, it's been held up in production for so long. I don't really have very much hope that it'll become anything. But
is that partly because of the virus, or?
I don't know what it's about. I regularly see books that I remember coming out the same time as mine, or even a year after, that are like coming to Netflix. And mine is not even, I don't even think they're ready to give it the green flag for going into pilot production or anything like that, or casting. So I don't really have very much hope, but I sort of exist in this hope deficit area. So if anything good happens, that it's a great surprise.
Yeah, I try to do that too. Would you have any role in the creation of the scripts, the series?
My agent, she told me, I mean, Sterling Harjo is the director that's been pointed to adapt it and direct it. And my agent originally told me that I could probably have as much involvement as I wanted, but it would really take a lot of time, take a lot of my time. And it's not really, I don't have any training in it, as much as I'd love to see it on screen and as cool as it would be to have an all-native cast. I hope it happens, but I don't really want to have anything to do with it necessarily. I like working in fiction.
It seems like Sterling Harjo would be a very good person to have adapted. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm seeing questions go flying into the chat, and I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that our audience gets to talk to you as well. So
I think I saw one I can answer really quickly. Somebody said, "Where did you get your shirt?" And I don't know if they're on sale right now, but the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, on one of their walls, has this mural, and so it's just a picture of, somebody took a photograph of the mural and then put it on a t-shirt. You might be able to get it from their website, but I'm not sure if they've done any recent printing. So, but that's where it's from.
Would you like to go ahead and tell them about your blanket as well? Because I know some people are
Oh,
wondering.
sure. It's just an 8th generation blanket. That's a company in Seattle. Louis Gong, I think, is the guy who founded it. And I was given this by the American Indian Child Resource Center in Oakland. Either of those organizations would greatly appreciate donations. They're great Oakland Native organizations to donate to. If anybody has, there's a lot of students, so you probably don't have a lot of money to donate, but.
So just going through some of the questions, one of the questions was, could you do an explanation of the spider legs in the book?
Sure. If you are queasy at all, then plug your ears or leave the room. A lot of people asked if this is like a Cheyenne tradition or story or anything like that, and it is not. I pulled 2 spider legs out of my own leg. There was a bump on my leg. This must have been in like 2013. And I pulled 2 spider legs. They were about 1.5 inches long. There was a bend at them. I scoured the internet, much like the character Orville, and couldn't find any explanation for it. I called my dad because it seemed like it could be an Indian thing. And my dad said, it sounds to me like you got witched. And I was like, so what do I do? And he was like, I'll pray for you. And that was it. And so it seemed like it belonged in fiction, and so I put it in the book.
But there are other spiders throughout the book, right? There are other spider themes.
Yeah, and I already had some spider themes written when I pulled the spider legs out of my leg, so it especially felt like it belonged in the book and not in my life. Oh, somebody said it happened to my brother, spider legs in his. I'd never heard of anyone. If the person who said that happened to them, I'd love for them to talk about it, because I've brought it up to a lot of people and no one's ever referenced it happening to anyone they know. Would that person be willing?
We'll
Sure.
ask them to tell you their story in just a minute, but I wanted to tell you that when I was a little girl who lived across the street from me had a big bump on her arm, and her mother took her to the doctor and they lanced it, and baby spiders came. I was creeped out by that for like 2 decades. I couldn't go to their house. Anyway, who was it in the audience? Would you like to tell us your spider leg story?
Oh, hi there. Yeah, I'm not sure I know the story very well, but my brother, who's 2 years older than me, had talked about little spider legs coming out of his arm. Strangely, my brother had like a big peacock tattoo, but when he was in jail, he did this huge Native American head, and it's right there too. So the spider legs were popping out, and then, so I don't know all the details, but I know they had to like really scoop out the flesh, and he has a big scar there. I don't even know if he got to the doctor or if he was trying to scoop it out himself, but there's definitely a big scar there under the tattoo. But yeah, you think, did this happen? But yes, it did happen. It does happen. I guess spiders can put their eggs underneath the skin.
Yikes.
That's gross.
That's gross. Okay, PJ, next question.
Well, I asked Angela if she wanted to ask you a question. Angela, do you want to ask him?
Ani and Tommy, my question is about, you've spoken of your admiration for Louise Erdrich. Do you have a favorite novel of hers, and why? And what most deeply resonates with you with her work?
Roundhouse, I think, is Love Medicine, I think, influenced me in a more significant way than Roundhouse, but I loved Roundhouse more as a book. I just think she has so much poetic power, but she always keeps the story. She always keeps the reader engaged with the story, And I think the commitment to the reader and creating readable books is really admirable. I think readability is often not paid enough attention to. And you know, the idea that somebody's going to spend time with your book, I think you should respect the reader's time and take care to make your book engaging and readable. And I think Louise always does that. So she has the poetic power and an amazing way with language, but she always keeps the story going, and she has tremendous pacing. I think a book that a lot of people don't know, because a lot of people do know Roundhouse and love medicine, that I read maybe the beginning of this year, at the end of last year, for the first time, was Shadow Tag. It's a super good book, and if I were to recommend one Louise Erdrich book right now that probably less people have read, is Shadow Tag.
Great. I'm going to read that next.
Okay, Bridget, you can ask your question.
Oh, hello. Thank you. My name is Bridget. I am a member of Iguayagua, Taino of the Caribbean, the native people that met Columbus. I have been working on a memoir. It was my master's thesis here at Dartmouth College. I've graduated. I've been sitting on it for 5 years. Your work, do you feel like sometimes you have to shelf it for a while to come back to it? You know, sometimes things are really cathartic and could be kind of traumatic when writing it. And second question is, do you recommend that someone get an MFA to be, you know, looked at with seriousness by a publishing company? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And for who shared the Spider Lake story, I'm sorry I didn't say thank you. I appreciate you sharing that story about your brother. And it's the only one I've heard about somebody pulling spider legs specifically, because I have heard the spider eggs and the baby spider thing before, but the spider legs thing, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so for, unfortunately I think with novels, probably with any book length project, one of the secret recipes, not all of the time, but I think a lot of the time, is time itself. And as much as I guess, for instance, wanted to rush out my next book, I came to find that the only way to get perspective on it without destroying it in revision was to leave it alone. And if you keep returning to your work and your sentences seem tired or like you can't read them without feeling uncomfortable, a lot of times you just have to wait and give it time. And with time will come clarity. And it's called revision for a reason, because you keep looking at it again and again. And sometimes you have to wait because your eyes can't really see it with any clarity. And so I think time, definitely putting it on the shelf, or, you know, the digital shelf of your Google Docs or whatever, and letting it, and not thinking about it can sometimes be the work that you need in order to get fresh eyes on it and a fresh perspective on it. So I definitely have found that that leaving your work alone can help. As far as the MFA goes, I was pretty much anti-MFA before the years leading up to when I got into the MFA, believing that, you know, a lot of authors in the past wrote books and there was no such thing as MFA. But I found out about the Institute of American Indian Arts, and being around other Native writers felt or seemed like it would be really amazing. And there was a lot of Native faculty, and it was a low residency program, so you didn't have to relocate, and it was relatively affordable. All of those factors made me reconsider. What I didn't realize getting into the MFA, one of the values of it is building relationships with teachers who have books published, which means having possible access to the publishing world through relationships to your teachers. So not necessarily, the publishers won't necessarily, you know, if you have on your query letter that you have an MFA, I don't think that's going to sway very many publishers. I think the work itself is the most important part. But getting through the slush pile can be difficult because you don't really know the factors and why you may or may not be getting, you know, emails back or calls back for the work you submit. Whereas if you build relationships with teachers in MFA programs, sometimes you can get help with, you know, somebody sending your manuscript to this or that place. So I think it increases your chances to have access to the publishing world. That would be one of the benefits of the MFA. But I don't think just to have it on your resume or whatever, your query letter, I don't think very many publishers care, because if the work's there, that it doesn't matter. So I hope that answered your question.
So Deb, Baker, and Randy asked if you write poetry.
I'll never admit it. No, I have an event on Saturday, and for a book, a journal called Freeman's Journal, and I got a poem published in that issue that's coming out. But I'm pretty uncomfortable writing it, and it often comes out as prose, like prose poems. So, and I'm relatively new to poetry. For a long time, I think I resented poetry, feeling like it left me in the dark and was purposely being vague. And anyway, I respect and love poetry now, and I feel like I'm just have a long way to go in terms of understanding it, and in terms of coming to my own, whatever form it might take in my own work.
Okay, and we have a question from Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
Shall I just read Amy's question?
Yeah.
She said, Tommy, you said earlier that you did not start reading until sometime around after college. What insight can you offer a middle school teacher, me, trying to help students like you who don't want to read?
Well, in middle school, I guess it's not entirely true I wasn't reading. I remember reading Goosebumps in classes where I wasn't even supposed to be reading at all. But in terms of getting, I think if I knew that there were certain books out there that contained lives that looked or resembled ones more like mine, I think finding books, specific books that can, you know, there's so much of what I was taught was white male narrative being the gold standard, and a lot of teachers still toe that line. And I think if you're constantly reading about, you know, somebody that's lives that don't resemble yours, it's harder to connect. So in terms of the age itself, I wouldn't necessarily say it's any teacher's fault. I wasn't engaged. I didn't care about school. I had a lot going on at home. Nobody was really paying attention to whether or not I was paying attention in school. I was good at sports, and I liked doing that. So I wouldn't necessarily blame a failed middle school teacher, but I would say getting kids engaged in books that feel contemporary, or ones that resemble more their lives. And there's a ton of great YA literature out there now.
Yeah,
so I think that's probably a good place to start.
Okay, so the next question is coming from Shannon Morrison. Go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, I just wanted to know if you had read the author, David, I'm going to butcher his last name, but, and if so, if he's influenced you at all.
Who?
That's David Troyer.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've got to meet him. The last time I saw him, actually, we were in Minnesota for a literary conference, and we were in the hotel lobby, and he asked me if I was going to listen to Stephen King's band play, and I didn't really know about it, and I didn't end up going, and I regret that I didn't go see Stephen King's band play with David Troyer. I came to his work pretty late. His newest book, his nonfiction book, is incredible, and everyone should read it. But I can't say that I was influenced by his work because I sort of came to it late. Like something like the Hiawatha would have really, I think, affected me in a big way because it's a Minneapolis, I believe, or it's in Minnesota, and it's an urban native novel, and I wish I knew it existed a long time before I started writing there.
Okay, Angie, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. My question was if you could comment, hi, by the way, if you could comment on, big fan. Anyway, if you could comment on the absence of father figures in there.
I've got daddy issues. Just kidding. I think it's just the way that it came out. I think there's a lot of broken families in the Native world, and there are a lot of absent fathers. My dad was kind of not around after the age of 14. And I think more so what I was trying to write into, more so the presence of absent fathers was the presence of strong Native women, which I've known in my own life and in the Oakland Native community. There's a lot of, and you know, everywhere there's a lot of strong women leaders. So I was more writing into emphasizing the strength of Native women than I was emphasizing the absence of Native fathers.
Okay, we have a question from Laurie. Go ahead, Laurie.
Hi, I felt such a strong parallel between Dean's story and yours, and I was wondering if you intended to sort of make your creative process and your goals a character in some way through Dean.
Yeah, and different iterations of the book. I was actually trying to have the book sort of be his film project, and I got really confused and tried to get way too literal and was having actual interviews on the page happen, and that didn't really work. And you know, I got a storytelling project grant, just like Dean did, only I didn't do the project. I wrote the book instead. So there are parallels. Dean's backstory and his relationship to his uncle is not my backstory at all. That's totally fiction. So there were aspects that were, you know, all the characters I have something in common with, and some of the characters is a little more literal and a little bit more one-to-one, like Dean and Thomas Frank were two characters that are a little more one-to-one relationship, but I had relationships and similarities to all the characters.
I just really loved how it gave me insight. It felt like it was giving me insight into your creative process and your thinking about the book.
Thank you.
Okay, Deborah, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I just have a couple things to say. I taught middle school, and I found that if I did audio with the book and the kids could read the book and listen to the book, it really helped kids that couldn't really read too well. So I just wanted to point that out to the other woman. And I have like Jason Reynolds, I started following all these people now. Is there anybody in the Native, like with Native writers, middle school that would be good to start?
Yeah,
reading?
I think Rebecca Roanhorse is doing some pretty cool things, and I don't know if it's specifically YA, but it's like fantasy. It's definitely accessible, and I know that I don't know that many Native people that fall into that sort of Jason Reynolds category of YA literature, but I would hope that more are coming. Oh, sorry, I think you got muted.
Oh.
Amazing what's coming out right now is just amazing to me, because I didn't have anything in middle school that kids would like.
Somebody just referenced Eden Robinson's, she has a Trickster trilogy, and she's a First Nations author. I agree with that. Eden Robinson's amazing and totally would be great for teenagers. And she also, I think it's been adapted. I think one of the books is already either a TV show or a movie. So it's nice to have that too for kids. And I agree with you about audiobooks. If I would have had access to audiobooks the way it's accessible now, I would have become a reader way sooner. I was very distractible and always felt like I needed to be doing something to be listening. And with audiobooks, you can be doing two things at once. And I'm still that way. I still read a ton of audiobooks.
Okay, we have a question from Molly. Molly, go ahead. Molly? Okay, well, her question is actually very similar to the question I was going to ask you. Some chapters are written in first person, while others are in second and third person. Why did you choose this writing from different points of views and perspectives?
Yeah, so that all the different characters would come, they would come one way and in one point of view. And in part of my revision process was to switch POV. So if I was feeling uninspired, but I still wanted to be working at the novel, I would set myself the tedious task of transposing a whole chapter from whatever POV was into another POV. And what I found was experimenting with different POVs for all the different characters revealed different things about the characters, and it gave me options. If I thought that at first it was in first and then I moved it to third, and I liked the angle and the narrative distance that allowed for the character, or vice versa from third to first, I just played a lot with every character. I played with different POVs, so everyone got different POV treatments in order to see what it looked like. And so everyone landed in a different place. For instance, there's a second person POV, that's the Thomas Frank chapter. That whole thing came out really fast and came out at first in the third person. And then I switched it to the second, and a whole bunch of new writing came out of the switch, which is another cool thing that happens when you switch POVs. It's tedious, but it can also force new writing to happen, because there's just some ways of saying things that change when you change POVs, and some things that you wouldn't say if you were stuck in first person that you would end up saying in third person.
Okay. There was a question from Beverly Walters. She asked, can you explain the meaning behind the word remain, reclaim, and return, the titles for the parts of 1, 2, and 3?
In structuring, I wanted a 4-part book, and was putting it together for my MFA thesis and trying to think thematically what's happening. And so, the first part, it's telling stories about wanting to keep our stories, and, like Opal is being reminded to tell our stories. Dean's trying to get funded to tell the stories that's part of remaining. And part 2 in reclaiming, like Orville is trying to reclaim his culture that he didn't have necessarily access to, and he gets it through YouTube, and he's trying to reclaim something that he doesn't necessarily feel that he has been given in a way that he would like. So that is why that. And anyway, there was just different themes going on in each of the parts, and I was trying to think of, they all ended up being our words besides pow-wow, which structurally it just felt cleaner to be able to do that. I didn't want to force it, but those words just came to me when I was thinking thematically of, the big part of part 3 leading up to the pow-wow is this arc of Blue returning to Oakland from going back to Oklahoma to try to figure out her relationship to her tribe and her people. And she returns right before we go into the, the powwow chapter. So there are other ways that each of the words plays into the narratives, but that's what just came to me now. And when I was putting the book together, I maybe had more reasons, maybe better put, but that's what I can tell you now.
So Angeline has a question for you. Go ahead, Angeline.
Hi, Tommy. My question is about writing in the second person point of view. Did you have any pushback at all about that? Second person is so rarely used and so rarely used effectively. And your Tommy Frank chapter, I think, is a masterpiece. And
thank you.
So I was just wondering about your thoughts about that.
I didn't have pushback, and I agree with you. It's not used very much, and I think it's a big risk. I think it's kind of a higher wire act, because you don't want to fail at it. I recently, during the pandemic, I had a short story published that was also in the second person, and it just kind of came that way originally. And the U is very much referencing me, although it's a fictional short story. But I got zero pushback. So I think it's all about believing in whatever you're working on, and work your sentences to death to try to get it. If you're convinced about the POV, then write it as best you can, so that so they have nothing to complain about.
So I actually have a question for you, Tommy. I know this is a question that a lot of authors hate, but is there an overall message that you hope readers would get from your novel about urban Indians?
I don't know that not a particular message. I think expanding the idea of what Native people are in contemporary America was something that I would hope that the novel would convey. But I'm not really big on like having a message. I think what novels are good at are building worlds and characters that feel like they could be real, and building possible empathy in a reader for those realities, and really exploring nuance and complexity. And for Native people, we have often been reduced and aren't allowed a lot of nuance or complexity. We've been simplified and erased so often. I just wanted for that to happen in the book. So not a message, but the effect of expanding our idea of what it can mean to be Native in contemporary times.
Okay, Kevin, you have a question?
Yeah, hi Tommy. Thanks for doing this. You talked about like enjoying audiobooks, so I'm curious how involved you were with the audiobook for There. I mostly listened to it and I enjoyed having the different narrators. So I don't know if that's something you had planned the whole way through, or if that's something like the publisher decided.
No, I was really lucky to be asked to give my opinion on the voiceover actors, and I think they're all Native. The majority of them are Native anyway. I know that for sure. And so I was given, the samples of the voices and some of their biographical facts. One of the main narrators, when I saw part of his bio, was that he was in a First Nations TV show about a guy trying to make a documentary about urban Indians. I was pretty convinced that he was the perfect fit. So I was asked, I didn't take the lead, but they certainly included me, and they did the work to make sure Native voiceover actors were the ones doing the voices, and I was very happy about that.
Did you write it all with that in mind, like thinking about the audiobook, or does that all just happen later?
No way. It wasn't even, I couldn't conceive of it being an audiobook. It being a book was, far-fetched in my mind, so.
Okay, the next question we have is from Charlie.
Hi, Tommy. I was wondering if you had siblings, and if so, did they influence any of the characters like Luther or Lonnie?
I have 2 older sisters, and I helped raise my oldest sister's daughter from when she was 16, is when she had, so I was an uncle in the 6th grade. So not in regards to Luther and Lonnie, I don't have any brothers. But in the Thomas Frank chapter, there's definitely my whole family, my family has called it our chapter. So that chapter, I'm referencing a lot of stuff that actually happened in my life. And I call it Thomas Frank because my first name is actually Thomas and my middle name is Frank. So I'm sort of like admitting that this is me. It's not entirely autobiographical, but there's a ton of real information from my life. But in terms of, yeah, that's my sibling situation. The Luther and Lonnie and Orville brotherhood just came from wherever fiction comes from.
Are there any other questions from anyone in the audience? If so, just let me know in the chat. So Tommy, I'm actually going to ask you, you said the book is a continuation from the next book you're working on. Will you be including some Alani characters?
You know, I regret not having some aspects of a Aloni narrative. At the time, you know, I tried to not write from any other tribal perspective. The only person that's not Cheyenne Arapaho is Lakota, and I'm technically part Lakota as well. So in a similar sense of like not wanting to write outside of my own experience, I didn't want to write from other tribal perspectives. So I think I do have references to the Ohlone people in the next book, but I don't have Ohlone characters, and that's just because I don't. Unless I feel like I have a really good reason to, I don't feel right writing from at this point, from other tribal perspectives.
No, I understand that. I think we're pretty much done here. Shannon, do you want to have any closing?
I just want to say thank you so much, Tommy, for your time. This has just been a really, really wonderful discussion. I know everyone who came really enjoyed it. So thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your questions. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, and once again, thank you so much, Tommy Orange, for sharing your remarkable work with us today. In closing, I hope everyone enjoys these cultural Zoom events offered by the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. If you wish to help us continue our work, please consider donating by visiting our webpage at aisc.ucla.edu. And also follow us on social media at UCLA AISC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And this is going to conclude our Zoom event. So thank you.
Thanks again, Tommy. Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Tommy.